Hello, Jesus people. Today on God Talks, I'm going to talk about how all things work together for good for those who are the called and according to his purpose. Okay, it's really hard to understand sometimes why bad things happen, why we have such difficulties, why we have such struggles. But, the word says, hey, you haven't contended until death yet, okay? You haven't fought sin until death. You're still alive. And so, what that basically means is that love is patient, kind, long suffering. It believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. But love never fails. Okay, it believes all things, it hopes all things, it endures all things. I mean, look at Paul, look what he suffered. I mean, Paul, if you want to talk about suffering, you want to complain about suffering, are you in Paul's position? Have you suffered like Paul? I mean, Paul, my goodness, he was beaten 5 times from the Jews, 39 stripes each. It says 40 minus 1, which is like close to death. He was stoned, shipwrecked. He was abandoned by his own brethren. I mean, just goes on and on. Read about Paul. Read about his suffering. See, the idea is we have to get so close to Jesus. We got to get so close. He had to be so close to God to have the confidence that he did. And so when we're in suffering, we've got to remember Paul. I mean, read about Paul. He is just the epitome of suffering. He understood Jesus so well. He understood, to live is great, but to die is gain for God. Okay, because we need to rejoice in suffering, because suffering and persecution is part of being a Christian. And so it's also it's what drives us to God. I mean, it's what makes us realize how much we need him. And then that's when God can really manifest a lot more in our lives, when we're in suffering. Paul said that whether he abases or abounds, he can do all things through Christ who strengthens him. I mean, that's pretty amazing that he can do all things. So God promises us that all things work together for good. If we give it to him, he's going to work out something absolutely amazing out of the tragedy and the difficulty of what you've suffered. And I don't know how he's going to do it. It's just the way God is. He does it to each individual person. Everything that Satan means for evil, God can somehow turn for good. I mean, this is called miracles. That's when you're in a perfect position for a miracle, is when God can turn something into good out of suffering and out of difficulty. Paul said he learned to be content in all things, okay? Contentment and joy is a sacrifice. Okay, joy is a sacrifice. Joy is not a feeling initially. The Bible says we worship him. We worship God in spirit and the truth, and we bring the sacrifice of joy. So joy and happiness, you got to guard your heart, because without joy and happiness, it's nothing. It ends up drying us to bones. It says joy and happiness is actually like a medicine, and without it, it'll dry your bones up. That's what it says. And the bones are the very life-giving thing of what creates your blood. And so in order to be healthy physically, we have to be healthy emotionally and mentally, which means being happy, allowing ourselves to enjoy life, to not be so stressed out. When we get overly stressed out, the cortisol goes up, the bad hormones. I mean, they're good in the morning, but they're supposed to go down during the day, not stay up. That's when people have all kinds of difficulty with stress and not being able to sleep. Those are spirits coming against us. That is what creates spiritual warfare. And so we need to practice sacrificing to God joy, the spirit of joy, and enjoy life and enjoy what he's given us. I mean, if we haven't suffered unto death yet, we haven't suffered sin unto death yet, that means we're in pretty good shape compared to Paul, who was beaten, shipwrecked, lost in the deep. I mean, gosh, read what he's gone through. We have no reason to complain. And you know what? He didn't complain. He said he actually taught himself through those things how to be content, because he knew Jesus was with him. He knew that God hadn't left him. He knew that he wasn't lost. He knew God hadn't abandoned him. I mean, this is how close that he was to Jesus, to know that Jesus Christ had not abandoned him. And so this is what we need. We need to get so close to God that we know that he hasn't abandoned us. And he learned to be content in all his sufferings. He learned to trust God, that God would not only never leave him or forsake him, but every single thing would work out for good. And for Paul, even though he died for Christ, which a lot of the disciples did. Look at his legacy. I mean, he wrote like half of the New Testament. I mean, it's incredible to think that Paul wrote so much of the New Testament, and the power in it for Jesus is just because Paul, he was a Roman soldier. I mean, he knew what sacrifice was. He knew what discipline was. I mean, because he was a soldier, an athlete. They know what discipline is. They know what self-discipline is. They know how to put the flesh down and let the spirit come out. Because they are trained warriors. They're trained in the army, and he was drafted in the army of God to preach deliverance to the captives, and he had to suffer for his knowledge was so high. He even had a thorn in the flesh that Satan had given him, that God allowed, because so he wouldn't get prideful of his knowledge of God. It was so much. I mean, that's how close he was to God. God even had to discipline him on top of all the correction that he had physically, and what he suffered, because he knew Jesus so well that he could have gotten so prideful because of his knowledge of the spiritual world. It's just incredible how close he was to God. And so remember, all things work together for good. We have to be like Paul. We got to learn to be content. Don't be worried about all this stuff. Don't be worried. It says, though the heavens and the earth move, though the mountains go in the sea, I will not fear, for God is with me. Okay? I mean, to die for Christ is gain. He's going to take care of us, and he said he won't give us anything beyond what we can what we can handle. That means with him we'll be able to handle it. We don't need to have fear and anxiety over it. It says, what can man do to me? We need to receive this boldness of God that he wants to give us through this power of his word. We need to receive the power of God, which is in Acts 2. Receive with speaking in tongues as the evidence. It's the fire power of God. It says that the tongues sat on each of them, the cloven tongues of fire. So we need to receive the cloven tongues of fire. We need to have the power of God, Spirit dwelling in us. That's second chapter of Acts, okay? Don't get that confused with the tongues interpretation, which is a gift in Corinthians. So we need to really read Acts and make sure we understand it. And it's the power unto salvation. It's the seal of salvation, and it's also the comforter, because Jesus said he won't leave us without a comforter. And so we need to learn to be content. Paul learned to be content. He taught himself how to be content, and we need to sacrifice joy. So we get up every morning with this adrenaline of God, because God's the one that gives the adrenaline. We need to guard our hearts. That is the happiness and the joy in our lives is from God. It's God's Spirit, and we need to give him credit. We need to guard our hearts, and we need to and when we give him credit for this, we need to recognize it's him. He's God. Jesus Christ is pure adrenaline, okay? And we need to recognize that and live in that. If we give up our hearts, okay, if we give up our excitement and our love, we don't have anything. That's our power. It says the joy of the Lord is your strength.